Hi Dana.
Hi, Shari.
Hi Dhewni.
Yes. Hi, Charindra.
Dhewni is here today because we are going to talk about something very particular that happened last week.
I thought
Dhewni-
it's cricket, Shari.
that's last night, and we are still very happy. We are still sort of celebrating that, even while at work, while recording, while doing anything. We are thinking about last night. But fantastic performance.
But you've done well on the other front as well. I think you introduced.
That's it, exactly. on the other front. So the other front that we've done well and which was evidenced last week was on the corruption perception index. So Dhewni is here because Dhewni is from Transparency International Sri Lanka. Dhewni, you can first of all just give an overall idea to our audience about what you do, what your role at TISL is, and then maybe we can bring you into the conversation.
Sure. Firstly, I don't think I'm as elated as Charindra is about the cricket with the CPI score. Let's get that clear. But we'll get into that a bit later.
CPI being corruption perception index
Yes.
score.
So
We haven't done that.
Maybe
really.
Charindra will come after the Sri Lanka Zimbabwe match to the same.
maybe we'll dial it down a little bit
I
after that.
I hope not, but let's see. I'm ready for anything with Sri Lanka.
It's the same with in this context as well.
Yes, exactly, yeah.
So my name is Dhewni. I'm the Senior Advocacy and Research Officer at TISL. My work mostly entails sort of policy analysis and legislative review of obviously anti-corruption focused legislation, right? So over the last couple of years with the post-crisis context and with the IMF in the country and all sorts of changes due to what we went through in 2022. There's been an influx of laws, policies, mainly a lot to do with the economic front, but also the anti-corruption front. So my work the last couple of years has entailed looking at those, making sure that they're fit for purpose, that they get passed with as little loopholes as possible. So we advocate for essentially a stronger anti-corruption legal framework and also try and ensure proper implementation of those laws and policies as well. To strengthen overall oversight, transparency, accountability within the governance system in Sri Lanka. So that's broadly where I work and my area of work currently at TISL.
Okay. Obviously that's why you're here, because you would directly have some involvement with the topics that we are discussing today. So I want to start off with the corruption perception index, but just at a very, very granular level of why is it the corruption perception index as opposed to the corruption index? Because a lot of people don't really appreciate the difference between corruption and corruption perception. What's the difference?
So I can, again, with any tool or especially a perceptions indices, right? It's all boils down to how you use it, what it is and what it isn't. So I can speak to what the CPI is. And right, as you rightly said, it's a perception of public sector corruption within a country.
This is purely on public sector corruption.
Purely on public sector corruption.
Okay.
Right. So it looks at it's based on surveys, right? So the surveys look at bribery. It looks at allocation of funds. It looks at public financial management within public institutions. It looks at whether there's nepotism, whether it's a meritocracy, things like that. Those are the questions that are reflected in these surveys. And these surveys are mostly directed to the business community, investors, and there are sections of the tool that also cover the general public, but it's quite limited. This is mainly focused on academics, experts, and the business community. So how the tool itself works, Transparency International has 13 data sources that they use for the CPI. Out of those 13, 8 have been used for Sri Lanka this year. And these scores are then rescaled to fit the 0 to 100.
Dhewni, why out of 13, 8 have been used in Sri Lanka?
So
why
there's
not
a-
all 13?
So there's a criteria that Transparency International has to when selecting out of these 13 data sources, right? So they look at the methodology, they look at year-on-year availability of the sources, they look at how well these sources, how well the result of these sources can be adjusted to fit the CPI. So there's certain criteria that they use to select sources essentially, and overall, a minimum of 3 sources required for a country to be included.
Right, okay.
So Sri Lanka this year they used 8 sources out of those 13 that they have verified. So just a very brief as in how the CPI works. It's a score from 0 to 100, right? 0 being very corrupt and 100 being very clean. And how it works is these sources are then standardized to fit that 0 to 100 scale, and then it's a simple average of those sources that gives you that CPI score. So Sri Lanka this year was 35. So that's the average of those 8 sources that have been re-standardized to fit within that CPI bracket. That's a very
Right, yeah.
just the gist
So,
of-
so 35 means out of 100 as
Yes.
a percentage, 35. And there are certain countries in the top tier who are around 90.
around 80, yes.
Around, yeah. I think there's
88.
someone at 87,
88,
right?
yes.
Yeah, 88, yeah. So we are not even half that,
No, we're not.
okay?
So the global average is 42.
Global average is 42. So we are well below the global
well below,
average.
yes.
So, but yeah, I suppose small mercies, right? In terms of our history, our track record, this is something that we can be happy about. But just one more question on the ranking. When you what does this ranking actually tell? So we have gone up 13 places, right? What does that say about Sri Lanka as a country when you look at the other countries which are above it and below it? Because Sri Lanka climbing 13 spots, in absolute terms, what has that meant? Because Sri Lanka could actually rise 13 places, Dana, if 13 countries above Sri Lanka
Have reduced.
yes, have gone down. So is it that Sri Lanka has come up because the bar has been lowered, or has Sri Lanka objectively got better?
So, in my opinion, in terms of reading the CPI to the best of, for it to serve its purpose the best it can, you look at the score as opposed to the rank because it tells you more, right? Because again, like you said, the score can reflect changes that have absolutely nothing to do with Sri Lanka sometimes, right? And this year is also the first year in over a decade where the global average has reduced. The global CPI scores have reduced as well. So there are so many factors that don't have anything to do with Sri Lanka that can contribute to those shifts. You also have to remember that within a certain band, within a certain score even, there are so many countries, right? So many countries lie on that same line, on that same sort of interval, right? So then when there are shifts in the rank, it means less than it seems, essentially, right? So context in viewing the rank matters, right? So when the global global average has declined for the first time in 10 years, that tells you, okay, there have been a significant number of countries that have declined across in that that leadership board, that ladder, right? It's also important to a technicality within the methodology is also that there's a standard of error, right? There's a standard of error, sorry. There's what's called a confidence interval.
Yeah.
So it's a 90% confidence interval, right? So it's a range in which our score lies. And that again is because there are so many countries within that same band or within that same score, right? And what's interesting is, so our score this year still lies within the same confidence interval as last year. Our confidence interval, our range in which our score sits has not really changed much in the past 12 to 15 years, right? So those small upticks and downticks, it's still within that same range. So to see a reflection in the score of any real meaningful institutional change, any institutional progress, is, essentially seeing that a jump over a certain period of time, as opposed to what we've been doing over a certain period of time is sort of stagnating within that interval, right? So you want to see progress is seen by sort of breaking that cycle and then moving out of that sort of interval that you've been in for such a large period of time, which we've seen other countries do. But unfortunately, that's the best way to use the corruption perceptions index to sort of give you an idea of actual meaningful structural change within a country, right? Because perceptions can shift. I mean, we all know that. And especially coming post-crisis, right? We're coming off of somewhat a period of great instability, right? And perceptions shift because of it.
And then a very quick question, what's the sample size? Because generally Sri Lankans are also concerned about you measure the perception, you said it's a business community, and it's also in particular it's about the public sector corruption as what I understood. So what's the perception, and what's the ranking that we have done quite well in the history of the CPI, where we were ranked topped over the say 10 years or 15 years, where have been the best performance of Sri Lanka?
So okay, so to answer that, I'll quickly go back to how the methodology works, right? So like I said, it's 8 so they're data sources. So some examples of it is The Economist has a survey that they do, the intelligence unit. The World Bank has a institutional and policy analysis that they do every year. I believe it's the World Justice Project. There's a survey on rule of law, etc. So these are the sources that Transparency International uses. So these 8 are then combined to give you the CPI. So within these 8 are also surveys. They're also perception based, right? So they each have different sample sizes that then feed into our overall CPI score.
Right.
And this year particularly, when you sort of look at a couple of them in detail, function of government is somewhere we have scored quite low, right? Which again represents those institutional structures.
What do you mean by function of government?
Function of government is essentially perception of service delivery, or how certain mechanisms within governance need to function, especially oversight mechanisms, accountability mechanisms, transparency within government. All of that contributes to the functioning of government, right? We've scored fairly low in function of government, which again feeds into the fact that it needs to be a structural change as opposed to just a change in sort of culture or attitudes at a given point in time. One of the sources that has been quite consistently used for Sri Lanka is a survey done by the World Economic Forum. So it's a survey that collects the perception of investors and business community. That is where Sri Lanka has sort of fallen this year. Again, coming off of a massive economic crisis that's not unheard of, right? And to answer your question on where we've seen sort of historically where we've seen us improve, that also relates to this World Economic Forum survey, which was done in 2012, which we scored quite high in, right? Now, again, that can also be attributed to post-war development, right? We saw increased spending in infrastructure, all of these things, they shift perception, right? And it's also important to remember that perception usually lags behind reality, right? So perception will come first, always, but then reality will always show you what's
and
next,
also perception is also going with the expectations, right? Like the expectation of level of corruption in 2012 versus like the expectation of 2000.
No, I think that's the thing. I think we are starting from a low base.
Correct.
So
Correct.
the low base effect is going to make 2025 look, fantastic.
Yes, exactly.
But it's interesting. I didn't know that it's like a composite.
It's a composite
So-
index.
index
Yes.
because you have taken the World Economic Forum, the World Bank, and other sources. So it's not like sending like a questionnaire and ask like where
No.
do you rank Sri Lanka in terms of like under these
So
indicators.
there is nothing done uniquely or particularly for the corruption index,
So
perceptions index.
it is those composite of 8 scores, and Transparency International also does their own survey within each country. So it's a combination of all of
But then what? They do-
Transparency
yeah,
International does their own survey within each country as
Within
well.
each
So it's a composite of all.
Yeah,
of
exactly. My point. So it is not only
Purely,
the
no,
yeah,
absolutely not.
because so there is that one measures what exactly the Transparency International one.
So that measures the perception of of bribery within the public sector,
Right.
of trust within
So that is
institutions.
yes. So that is directly connected to the final.
It's
product.
it weighs as much as all the other sources does.
Okay,
So it's a
yeah,
composite.
fine, yeah, but I think for a person looking from the outside, that would be sort of the most closely aligned with, because the general public associates corruption with this under the table bribe giving and all of that.
Yeah.
They don't really think about the nuances of corruption. No.
Yeah.
So I think this measures that. Dana, why are people celebrating this in terms of the ranking rise, and how is it important for a country's economy? Okay, can you develop Sri Lanka's economy while having it riddled with corruption?
Yeah, so why we are celebrating for the same reason, because we have a very poor track record when it comes to corruption. So even like a small improvement
Yeah.
is considered as a reason for celebration. Like the same as cricket, Chari. Sorry, I mean after so many losses, even like one single win gives us so much of relief. I think that's one reason. But coming more seriously about whether we can move ahead without, why corruption is, why it's important. I think there are two sides to this. One is we need to understand this corruption is not the final, like the outcome. It's in my view, it's a byproduct of a process or a policy issue most of the time. Because when you have, it doesn't mean that people just corrupt because there's a policy issue. Of course, that integrity, the personal impact is also there. But when you have a kind of a poor policy framework, that improves corruption at a grand scale. Let's take as an example, I'm sure most of us have tried to build a house, or like get the approval from the technical officer at the municipal council, or like every time when there's, you call the discretionary power, where someone basically approves or gives an endorsement or a stamp on your choice, there's room for corruption. The more that you have that, we are increasing the room for corruption. I think what we need to do in terms of when moving forward with development, we have to limit that space where people giving discretionary power. I think the best example is how this feels uncomfortable is when you apply for a visa, and when you go for the visa interview, regardless of all documentations being done, you always have that kind of excitement whether actually they will, I don't know, at least it's the case for me, because you're not sure whether actually because they can say no, your document is it's not complete, some reason, So every time when you have some, when your choices are dependent on someone else's discretionary power, I'm not saying visa process is corrupt or like,
Right.
but you have that uneasy feeling.
Yeah.
When you have the room, you try to
Yeah.
avoid that
I think
uneasy
that-
feeling by,
Yes, I
doing
think
something.
the difference between the visa process and what you're talking about is that in the visa process, it is very interpersonal in terms of the look and feel, the way a person converses. Those are qualitative factors that maybe can't be captured in the system. But now when it comes to some of the permits that are required, that shouldn't be qualitative,
Absolutely.
Dana, right?
Absolutely.
And when it is qualitative, when it is based on discretionary power, then that leaves the door open for if you're the approving party and I'm the recipient or the intended recipient, for me to come and give you something outside the
Absolutely.
required means.
That's a huge gap in the system, right? And maybe not even one gap, many gaps in the system that then contribute to this, right? So if Dhananath wants to get a permit, right, are there specific criteria, and are those criteria publicly available, right? And then that's your transparency coming into play there. So even if processes aren't perfect and if processes need to be fixed, if there is mechanisms for accountability and transparency, then still certain risks can be mitigated, right? So in terms of the full system of the picture of the complete system, right? Are there accountability mechanisms? Are there transparency mechanisms? Are there proactive disclosure mandates, right? So if you do go and if there is considered discretion for an individual to approve or disapproval a permit, what holds them accountable? What is there transparency for scrutiny, essentially, right?
Yeah.
So in one process maybe can't be fixed, but an entire system can hold that process accountable.
Yeah,
Right.
and what a lot of people don't seem to realize is that this is not about one government.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
So when you have a good government with good governance who is clean, that doesn't make the urgency of reforms
Any less.
and accountability any less. In fact, that should be the time that you really try to bring it in, because you have a better chance if they are actually clean.
Exactly.
Okay.
So it's not dependent on one government or one individual. This president is good, that president is not good, but we have got that president out and this president is there, and therefore we are out of the woods. No. So Dhewni, in terms of what we were just talking about the cost of corruption on an economy, and either of you can take this actually. Couldn't someone in Sri Lanka point to countries which are developed or developing rapidly, despite having a culture of corruption, despite not really combating corruption, and say, look at them, that is a global power now, this country is a rising giant. What are you talking about corruption, right? They are doing fine. The world is looking at them. The world wants to deal with them. Why is this such a big deal?
So I'll just say a couple of things, and I'll let Dhananath get into the sort of economic granularity of it. But I think in a lot of discourse, right, we like to pick the exception and make it the rule, right? And I think that's the case as well when it comes to case studies where I'm sure there are countries, right, which aren't thriving on the CPI, but show good signs of economic progress and development. But I think, again, there needs to be some discipline, and you need to sort of intellectual discipline, and also just be cautious with making an exception the rule, because, again, context matters, the Sri Lankan context matters. We have seen in our past the detrimental effects of corruption, right, in terms of massive state losses. We're coming off of a severe economic crisis, and governance failures and corruption risks have played a huge part in it, right? From weaknesses in public procurement management, and like Dhananath said earlier, ministerial discretion, all of these things in terms of public financial management. All of these things have led to one of the worst crises of our time. And, we'll be very careful to sort of attribute a model that has proven to not work in Sri Lanka, to Sri Lanka, right? But yeah, like I said, I would let Dhananath take the lead on that question.
Yeah, so again, Chari, when it comes to the granularity of it, and on looking at the overall aspect, I would recommend you look at giving more choice. I'll take another example. Now, I think for common man, the most, how shall I say, closest example is when they got caught to a traffic violation, right? So the fact that you are trying to give someone a bribe is not merely that you cannot afford it. Sometimes it's the choice of the payment method. Because anyway, if you are bribing and getting away with your license, you have anyway there will be some level of expenditure. It's just at one point before this GovPay and all that was implemented, it's just a matter of like you are getting a ticket and then you have to go to the post office and then you pay that and again you go back to the police.
So I think that's also a good example of how technology and automation and the digital economy can reduce the need for corruption.
Absolutely. So it is merely the choice. Like, okay, you have the choice that you can take the ticket and pay at the post office. I think that wasn't really dismantled. But at the same time, you can pay it online and get it there because it's convenience. So I think, again, if you look at on an overall angle of choice, when you have a broad range of choice, then you can minimize the corruption in my view. But again, there will be corruption anyway. Again, it is not an endorsement that people should be corrupted.
It's human nature.
Human nature. There will be some level, but of course, even like in the countries who are doing well, they are at 80s and not even 90s, right? So 80s. So that means the top performing country also has corruption. No two words about it.
I think Norway.
Norway,
Norway is number one. Yeah. So 88. Yeah.
Still, so you have to look at the overall choice point of view. One. Second is, this is fundamental for any economic growth because perception matters. Perception matters because when you feel that it's corrupt, even look at like when you are going to let's say, when you are visiting Kenya or African country, you pretty much how you prepare is completely different from when you are going to, let's say, Norway or somewhere because your perception matters. It's same with investment and everything. So the perception matters, not only the perception, the real corruption also has to come down. But this can only be changed, in my view, through a lot of policy. I have seen like Transparency has done like a lot of good work on like finding the most the most uncorrupt person or like the integrity awards and things like that to really identify the people who really driven with integrity, which is definitely important. But when you're looking at mass scale, like a massive system, especially a country like Sri Lanka, with massive government sector, then it is basically bringing choice and also cutting the size of the government. It doesn't mean the private sector is uncorrupt. Private sector has massive corruption. I mean, I want to be very clear on that because there are two sides now. Because why the government sector gets corrupt is not the government bribing each other, or not the petroleum corporation is bribing the electricity.
It takes two to tango, yeah.
Exactly. So there's definitely the private sector who is involved. But when you
but just to pick up on that point, then can the private sector turn around and say, we are that driver that motorist who got caught by the police, and we prefer to pay up than go through the inconvenience of going to the post office and all that is us. We are only doing it because the system necessitates it.
Correct.
Okay, so can they say they are just unwilling participants in this system, and if the system is fixed, the private sector will not be that corrupt because they won't need to be?
No, they can say that, but the truth is, leaving the corruption thing aside, how the private sector also sometimes got prospered was also through unsolicited proposals and pretty much moving away with competition and all that. Yeah. So that's also part of corruption.
Proximity to the government.
Absolutely, proximity to the government. So I think they should not go scot-free on that. Of course, there are limitations when it comes to convenience factors like traffic fines and all that. But private sector is also kind of part of it. But it has been influenced, in my view, because of the poor processes. So that's where we as advocates always say, bring the competition in, because that's one way to minimize the corruption. You have to look at an overall system. Unfortunately, a lot of Sri Lankans see it as a personal thing. Okay, you as a person has to have the value of integrity,
Yes.
which is 100% true. But we are talking about like 20 million people. You cannot expect
a system should be immune to a person's integrity, right? Whether or not that's like what you brought up earlier. A system can't be vulnerable to the political leadership it has at a given point, right? That's what we're all trying to achieve here.
So on this private sector point, Dhewni, like now you mentioned at the outset itself that this corruption perceptions index is about the public sector.
Right.
Have you done any work? Has TISL done any work on the private sector, and what have you found? Does that match our views of the private sector?
So TISL has a report that was launched 2 years ago called the Corruption Risk Mapping Research. That was a sort of an assessment done on potential corruption risks within the private sector, right? And how this sort of feeds into our overall discussion on systemic change is that a lot of these vulnerabilities exist within these areas of governance, right? Like you rightly said, Dhananath, public procurement, right? It's one of the biggest areas of government spending, and it's also one of the biggest corruption risks in the country. It's also one of the areas where private sector is a major stakeholder, right? And it's, again, one of the areas where we have the weakest governance, right? So we're expecting a new public procurement law. We already have new procurement guidelines and a manual which also unfortunately fall short, which are not fit for purpose, which like you just said, they don't regulate unsolicited proposals. They don't even mention unsolicited proposals, right? Which is a huge, it's a huge leakage for the country, and it has been for decades now. We've seen so many white elephant projects come up, and all of this was due to not even poor, just poor public procurement management.
Yeah, I want to touch on public procurement as well, because, like you said, that's a hotbed of corruption.
Yeah.
Explain briefly for the audience what unsolicited proposals are versus the tendering process.
So essentially, an unsolicited proposal is when a third party, right, not the government, the third party identifies a need within the government, essentially public service, and offers a solution to it, right? So there's no assessment done by the government. It's not within a certain procurement plan or a national development projects plan, anything of the sort. Or an investment plan of the government, right? It's completely a third party's approach to solving a problem or a gap that has also been identified by the third party, right? And essentially, going with
essentially it's a pitch, right?
Somewhat it is. It's a pitch to the government.
It's a pitch to the government. It could be some agency, maybe an ad agency or whatever, that identifies a big company and says, okay, your website isn't good, your marketing isn't good.
Let us do this.
Yes. So here's a proposal. Let us work.
And then you're bound though by essentially contractual obligations just to that third party. So there's no competitive bidding involved, right? There's no call for proposals. There's no technical evaluation committee to sort of go through what the best, what the best direction would be in terms of a supplier or a contractor. And there's also no an assessment of the need for it done by the government, right? Because we have, investment plans, we have procurement plans that the government makes essentially that they're supposed to follow annually. And when you're deviating from this, you're also essentially allocating funds that you hadn't allocated before. And for unsolicited proposal especially, right, when you haven't done an assessment of whether this is a need of the government, if you haven't called for proposals, if you don't have a technical evaluation committee to evaluate bids, because again you don't have bids, that is clearly not responsible management of public funds, right? And when we have procurement laws that allow for this, not only allow for it through the procurement process, but then also you have the ability, to sort of get approval for a project just through cabinet, right? Without any sort of technical evaluation being done, no public consultation, nothing
and
of the sort.
And it has happened.
And it has happened in the past. I mean, most of our infrastructure and development projects, that's how it's been in the past, right? With so much ministerial discretion.
Yeah. Dhewni, you mentioned that the legislation that is in the works about public procurement isn't really up to the mark, including the manual. Why is it not? What are the major red flags about
So
it?
the major one is the fact that there's no mention even of unsolicited proposals,
Right.
right? So there's a major loophole. I mean, are they regulated? Are they banned? How are they regulated? There's absolutely no.
So does it leave the door open for
for
unsolicited
it,
proposals?
for it to be business as usual as it has been for decades now, right? So we also have a public-private partnership law coming in. So whether that will address unsolicited proposals, we don't know yet. But again, the fact that it's not in the procurement framework, public procurement.
Yeah, why should it be outside?
Yeah, and even if it is, it still needs to be
Yeah, exactly.
addressed within the public procurement legal framework as well. So, and the fact that it's not is a major loophole and a huge corruption risk.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think there's Murtuza says it nicely that most of the people who got rich in Sri Lanka, they sold something completely unnecessary to government at an exorbitant price, or they bought something which is very valuable from the government at a dirt cheap rate, right? Those are the ways that basically a lot of, I'm not saying
Yeah, we are not saying everybody.
everybody,
who are
I'm
rich,
saying
they are honest businessmen, but then there
Absolutely.
are a lot of
Yeah, so
not so
that's
honest.
exactly. So that's
Exactly.
where this unsolicited. When you say unsolicited, that's a lot of people unfortunately do not understand when you have a way to compare that it gives a lot of pressure for you to bring the prices down. Like look at even a pair of trousers or anything, Chari. When you compare, okay, that place the price is lower or higher, then it gives you a way to measure, right? So that actually you keep the other person accountable. That's why in economics says when you see a price tag, this price is not only about your price. It is actually it reflects someone else's price as well, because you're always, before you price, you as a businessman or whoever, when the other prices are available on the same category, you think twice before you put your price tag.
Yeah.
Right? So it's not about the price of that good or service. It's all about reflecting your efficiency, your competitors' pricing, your supply chain, everything, your corruption, everything is incorporated in this tag. So when when there are many price tags available, actually you're bringing pressure on your own price tag to bring it down. Now the difference of a private sector corruption versus a public sector corruption, ultimately it's passes to the consumer, whether it's private sector or public sector. Only difference is when it's private sector corruption, if there's competition available, that can be, the consumer at least has a choice. But in public sector, without a choice, it's being passed to the taxpayer. I'm not sure whether I was clear enough.
Yeah.
For an example, let's say three of us are manufacturing shoes. Both of us are importing raw material from from India. If all of us have to pay a price for corruption, it could be the other way around as well. Huh? I pay a price for corruption and I bring the material at a lower rate, including the corruption. So in a way, the price is included in my pricing, but it is comparatively lower than yours and yours. So actually I have an undue advantage because I can price it lower. So you will go out of business. At the same time, if I am corrupt, let's say I am getting a business because of corruption, but you are doing the business without corruption, so then your prices has to be lower than my price because I have to cost it ultimately for the price. So it can go either way.
Both ways,
because
yeah.
this is a problem. The classic example is on the Indian Revenue Department. Because some people are not paying taxes, some are paying taxes. So the guy who pays taxes, definitely his pricing has to be higher than the guy who doesn't pay taxes. So you are basically, that's a lose-lose situation, because when that happens, actually the guy who pays taxes thinking, how can I avoid tax? How can I evade tax? Because if I don't evade taxes, I cannot compete with the other guy. So that can be completely a vicious cycle on corruption. So that's why we always say economics is all about keeping a level playing field. Because when you only have a level playing field with information available, you can bring the corruption down. Otherwise, when you have an unlevel playing field, actually the uncorrupt guy can be influenced for corruption, or like evading taxes or giving bribery and bring your cost structures down. because you cannot no longer be in the business by becoming uncorrupt. So that's something that's very tricky, and that's why it's fundamentally important that we have a kind of low corruption regime if we are really serious about taking the country to the next stage.
Yeah, and one thing that I notice about public sector corruption and private sector corruption is that if in the case of the public sector, it directly affects the taxpayer, because generally when it comes to the consumer makes the choice of whatever amount that he or she is paying, knowing the conditions around it. Whereas here, because the consumer doesn't directly make that choice, it is out of the hands of the consumer. And in the example that Dhewni brought in about a public, like an SOE or whichever public institution decided to go with an unsolicited proposal, the consumer has no choice in that matter whatsoever. Whereas I feel like in the private sector, you have a choice.
Correct.
Because the taxpayer doesn't pay their tax thinking, okay, this is going to the electricity board, this is going to Sri Lankan Airlines. They pay it in bulk.
Correct.
So they don't have a choice about the decisions that are made. And I think that's one of the worst things about public sector corruption. Let's talk about solutions also, right? And I can open this up to one of you. What if you had to? So now there's a legislation coming in. She's saying it's incomplete. Not her. TISL is saying it's incomplete. That could be one solution, a complete one. But if that is incomplete, then what is the next solution? Can you pressure the government to make it complete? In the public,
why it is incomplete? Like,
because she's saying that it has not eliminated the possibility of
The abuse
unsolicited
of
proposals.
It hasn't addressed it in any shape or form,
Yeah.
right? So there's no regulation of it whatsoever. So I'm not going to speak specifically to public procurement, but just in general, right? When processes fail or legislation fails, usually there's a need for accountability, right? And that stems from having the information that you need to hold government accountable, for public information that's needed for public scrutiny, right? So when there are opaque governance structures, when there is no proper implementation of the people's right to information on the activities of the government, then scrutiny becomes nearly impossible, right? And that's what we've seen in all aspects of governance, including public procurement, right? So let's go with the procurement example, right? So there are contracts that are being awarded. Were they being published anywhere? Were calls for proposals always published for a decent amount of time? Were selected suppliers publicly and proactively disclosed? This is information that even if that system and that process has errors and that process has risks, these are systems that could have ensured some level of accountability, right? If there was information that the public could have accessed, that the public could have, with civil society or experts, academics, that could have held the government accountable, could have asked questions if this information was published, right? And that's on the public procurement front. And it applies to so many other areas of governance as well. Take private sector corruption, right? A huge area that we work on is beneficial ownership information transparency. So beneficial ownership is essentially the true owner of a company, right? So there are so many layers that people can hide behind, so many structures of ownership, but a beneficial owner is the true human beneficiary of a company, right? So something that TISL has advocated for a long time, and the reform came in with the IMF program and post-crisis reform, the post-crisis reform agenda, was for us to have a beneficial ownership register, which has now been enacted into law. So the next step is implementation, right? Ensuring compliance and ensuring that there's proper enforcement.
What is the stage of that
So
register?
the law was just passed last year, right?
Mhm.
And the ROC, the Register of Companies, is the public institution that's in charge of its implementation.
Right.
So they essentially they're mandated by law to maintain a digital register. So they are supposed to publish information on the name of a beneficial owner, any former names, country of residence, business service, service address, and the nature and extent.
Yeah.
All right.
So just for
ownership.
everybody to understand why this is important.
Right.
The government, in that same example, the government could give a contract
Exactly.
to a private company.
Yeah.
That is
And-
then owned by
yeah.
a minister's
Yes.
sons,
So
daughters, or someone.
but that's the thing, right? So the minister's son owning the company is not visible to an outsider.
Exactly, unless you
It's-
have that
yes,
information,
it
right?
could be owned by Mr. I mean, it could be anybody.
It could
Yeah.
be any kind of relationship
Yes.
that, yeah.
Yeah,
Exactly.
it's John Doe, whoever.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, but the ultimate beneficiary of that becomes so if the registry is there,
Exactly.
then you can't hide it. You just have to go to the register and find out, this is where the money trail ends.
Right.
Correct.
So these are the sort of anti-corruption policy and legislation that we advocate for, right? And they always feed into each other. Another aspect of that fits exactly into the sort of framework that you were describing right now is asset declarations, right? Mandating all government officials of various levels of governance to declare the assets, right? Now, when you have asset declarations, you can match illicit wealth, unexplained wealth rather, right? When assets are declared by an official and there is obvious unexplained wealth in the public domain by a certain individual, there's a discrepancy there, right? There's a mismatch there that then can investigation can be initiated. We have frameworks for initiating such investigations. So these systems all feed into each other, right? So
Just picking up on that, Dhewni, and Dana, please come in here as well. The recent asset declarations, the ones that were made public, were incomplete as well.
Yes, it was
So-
the first. It was
So
the
is
first
it a
round of
trial and error
implementation.
situation, or just getting it up and running was a big deal, and we can improve it?
Yeah, so implementation is always what comes next, right? That's the next hurdle after sort of the reform agenda is sort of seen through and these laws are passed. So the new asset declaration regime was enacted in 2023, right, with the anti-corruption law. So there have been, loopholes. There's been communication back and forth with civil society, with implementing institutions to try and, get it fit for purpose. Now, is it currently? Probably not. But that's, again, just a part of the reform process, right? Getting it going, looking for loopholes and addressing them as and when we can. Like an example of that with the asset declaration system was initial publications had severe redactions, right? Unnecessary redactions, which essentially made them redundant. And this was flagged by civil society. It was brought to the attention of implementing institutions. And in the most recent IMF, the penultimate IMF review agreement under the structural benchmark, that very specific loophole has been addressed, right? It has mandated that particular public institution that is responsible for implementing asset declarations to fix that loophole of unnecessary and arbitrary redactions. Right, so it's again, you go back and forth until it's not a linear sort of process,
and
right?
it's not an overnight.
Absolutely. So,
Okay.
yeah, I mean, that's essentially the process.
Dana, going to ask you a straight question. You can give me a straight answer as well. How much of the credit for the improvement because it is an improvement, whether it's a huge improvement or not, how much of the credit for that improvement in the corruption perceptions index can be taken by the government?
I would say 50%.
50%?
Yeah.
50% only?
Yeah, because I think there are two sides. How I see it is because as we discussed in the same
So a
podcast,
lot of people are going to say now, Dhananath is not giving enough credit to the government. so many governments past were corrupt. Dhananath didn't say anything. Now Dhananath is not giving
No, I'll tell
credit
you
to
the
this
reason.
government. Okay?
Let's ask Dhewni. When was the data? I mean, I'm sure this the data on the World Economic Forum, the World Bank. It cannot be 2026, right? It must be the previous year.
Yeah,
Right.
2024,
Yeah,
2025.
2025.
2024, 2025, right?
Yeah.
So it's 2024,
2024
2025.
September is when
Correct. So the perception
president came in.
No, correct. So president came in 2024 September, right? So it is about a year, and the real change, in my view, was the anti-corruption law which came into power, because there are few major reforms that took place to avoid corruption. One is the anti-corruption law, which was there for some time, and it was under previous, regardless of, as again, whatever the government, but it came under the previous government as a part of, not only that government really wanted to do it. It was the IMF and other factors, the civil society, everyone, TISL, everyone wanted to get it done. I mean, it was very straight line, right? And then the Central Bank Independence Act, and then the Public Finance Act, and there's lot there are a lot to be done in terms of procurement and so many other things. So it was a process, because the challenge was on the legislation. I think this government should definitely get the credit, because they anyway came with an anti-corruption mandate. And the good thing that they did was they continued with that process. They executed some of the cases. So that credit has to be gone. But I think when you look at overall, okay, if Charindra challenges my score, maybe I'll increase it for 60%.
60%.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, 60%.
The bid is going
but,
on.
but we should not underestimate the policy. That's what you remember my initial premise on this.
Yeah.
It is not about a perception of an individual or a government per se. It's about the regulation and the policy which was laid behind that. That was, to be honest, laid by multiple governments, including the previous government. That's where again, it is not perfect. And again, having said that, it was the previous government. Not that they did it with the greatest intention. It was with a lot of other pressure from the society.
Turkeys had to vote for Christmas.
Exactly.
Because
Turkeys
IMF
had
made them.
to, absolutely. So if I'm only considering if it's like government, if it's two governments, 60% probably we can take that for, because it's also perception.
Yeah.
But if you look at like who should get the credit, it's quite divided across many sectors, like the TISL, the civil society.
Yeah.
The
A lot of people
bureaucrats.
forget the civil society role.
Absolutely.
And organizations like the TISL that work behind the scenes, because you don't have a big marketing team, right? So if you put out all the work that you're doing, I think...
And it's a hard job, because now this time they are safe because the rankings have slightly become better. Imagine if the rankings had gone down, the reaction by any government would be, okay, why is what's the logic, what's the sample size?
Yeah.
Then you question all sorts of things.
Yeah.
When your ranking is good, that's the best survey that ever has done. So but things are difficult when the scores are not in favor of the government.
So, Dhewni, we are almost at the end now. But before we wind up, I just want to know from your end, going forward, now we are almost 2 months into we have more than 1.5 months into the new year, but we have 10.5 months to go in this year. What steps would you like to see? So one, I think you articulated already the fact that the procurement law isn't complete and you would like it to be, made complete. But beyond that, what are, if you could name 1, 2, 3 in a particular order?
So I think since we touched on civil society's role, right? We'll also, I think it's important to acknowledge the environment in which we all work in. There isn't much space for public participation in governance in Sri Lanka, right? I think that's such an integral part of ensuring that policy and laws are fit for purpose. And like we're talking about this systemic change, and both Dhanath and I agreed on the fact that it is through policy, it's through legislation, it's through a policy, a change in policy. And one of the ways of ensuring that policy is fit for purpose is ensuring that there's public participation, that it's a consultative approach to policy making and governance in the country, which we've yet to see progress on. Civil society still has to claw their way into that process. There is no formalized process for that.
Yeah, so that's very important, and we'll pick up on it maybe in another show if possible. But the fact that you guys have to go and ask for the information without the government volunteering that information to you.
Yeah.
So that it's not proactive at all
Yeah,
on their part.
That's an aspect of civic space that needs to be improved, right? And then you also
Because they don't like you, no? Because they don't like the fact that because they wouldn't
I don't
want
know
the
about
civil
that,
society
but-
to dig too much into this because they actually consider that the
I
government
think it's
mentality
just it's also a lack. There's been a lack of civil society. There's lack of formalized civil society and public participation, right? There's no formalized mechanism. So when something has been around a certain way for decades, then obviously changing that is
Yeah.
difficult. But I think just identifying how important that is in governance and especially anti-corruption, right? And then obviously you have the continued use of laws like the PTA and the OSA that again shrink civic space that also feed into indices like the CPI very much, right? So there are, moving forward, I think increased sort of protection of civic space is a priority, absolutely. And ensuring that, the reform momentum that began in 2022 post-crisis is kept, that laws are passed intentionally, fit for purpose, and through a consultative approach.
Okay, great. Dana, if you have final thoughts, you can. Otherwise, we can go to
the
message.
No, I think important thing is to get this because understand the evolutionary process of this anti-corruption drive, because even an act like RTI was part of driving to this anti-corruption. Of course, the response rates are quite low, but at least still that's being there is critical.
And it shows you how long this process takes because that is 2017.
Absolutely.
Okay, and that started before 2017.
Exactly.
So
It's essentially it's a cross-cutting area of anti-corruption. Right?
Exactly.
You need a strong right to information regime for all of these other aspects of governance that we've been talking about to actually be successful as well, right? So oversight mechanisms, oversight bodies, appointment processes, all of that is contingent on also availability of information.
Exactly.
And while I reiterate the need for policy, it's also important that you have the proper finances and budget allocations to and implement the execution, because ultimately otherwise you will have like bunch of all sorts of policies. But what's the point if you're not really giving a attempt to execute it and implement it? So that's the other side, because even the COBOC, there's I think kind of questions whether the allocation was enough, whether they have enough resources.
So oversight and enforcement bodies have to be financially independent, right?
Yeah.
They need to have the autonomy to sort of enforce the law and also act as a very, very essential oversight body in terms of the government. And, allocations are different to actually allowing institutions to spend independently, essentially, right? And also ensuring that there's adequate leadership, that appointments are made in line with the law in terms of proper timelines, there are no delays. All of these things, they contribute to backsliding, essentially, in terms of anti-corruption reform.
Right.
All right. So we'll quickly give the... So thank you very much for joining our podcast, and you can become an Advocata Insider. This content is purely free of charge, but there's paid content that you can join us through Advocata Insider. It's a Sinhala platform. We provide futuristic predictions about exchange rate, the vehicle markets, and multiple other markets. But importantly, it's not about supporting, getting exclusive information. It is about supporting reforms where to minimize minimize corruption, at the same time on bringing more economic freedom. So then, as a country, we can move forward. What we want to do is to build a community who supports reforms, because that's the only way out from this crisis. And if we really want to improve the standard of living, reforms is the only answer, and economic growth is the only answer. So that's why you should become an Advocata Insider, so we can continue the good work that we do and also improve the economic literacy of our people. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Dana, as always. And special thanks to you, Dhewni, for enlightening us and giving us an insider's view of some of the wheels that are turning behind the scenes, and generally, making the conversation informative but entertaining as well.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. So we will meet next week, Dana, for sure. We will meet Dhewni as well, in the coming weeks.
If you can improve the rankings better, probably there'll be more.
Yes.
Or the other way around.
Hopefully.
Hopefully.
All right. Thanks, guys, and take care.